Welcome back to the Poetry of Night. Today's session was inspired by a dream I had in which a poet I know asked me if I would do a fog-centric episode. And because for me at least, the Poetry of Night has at least 1 foot in the realm of the dream, I decided to take the hint. In large part because fog itself, as a phenomenon, as an entity, is such an embodiment of that place of threshold and liminality in which there's a blur between boundaries before we're dropped fully into one side or another. And like fog, smoke, at least visually, has a similar effect, and both of them can be used to create a sense of mood, as in 2 famed modern and contemporary poets that come to mind who've used these images literally to create this feeling. I'm thinking, first of all, of T.S. Eliot in The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. Here, these 2 elements, eerily softening elements, smoke and fog, move even beyond their presence in the poem as imagery into metaphor, as the atmospherics slip into everything and behave finally like a cat in autumn. Meanwhile, I find Sylvia Plath's Sheep in Fog one of her most evocative and intriguing poems. And it's partly because it's not as though she completely abandons that feeling of bleakness and isolation that's in so many of her works. But they're softened somewhat, even in the effect of the title, where there's a feeling that the wool and the fog are blurring into each other. And perhaps this is even emerging as a fuzzy grayness that can be seen in the passing landscape. This somewhat insulates the impact of those raw inner emotional interiors, even as the poem itself continues to blossom into a dark vision of heaven and perhaps by the end, even impending death. Sheep in Fog. The hills step off into whiteness. People or stars regard me sadly. I disappoint them. The train leaves a line of breath. Oh, slow horse, the color of rust, hooves, dolorous bells. All morning, the morning has been blackening. A flower left out. My bones hold a stillness. The far fields melt my heart. They threaten to let me through to a heaven starless and fatherless, a dark water. If you were to try to imagine looking at sheep in fog, especially from a distance, it would be hard to tell where one of them begins and the other one ends. Just imagine how different this would be if instead this were a poem called Cows in Fog or Cattle in Fog. First of all, it would feel kind of funny, which this poem is not. But if you try to imagine what that would look like, any breed I can remember, Hereford Angus, the coloring is different. And it's just not going to, they're not going to blend together. There's not going to be that kind of fuzzy grayness between an animal and this atmospheric effect. Even the line of breath from the train seems to blur into the fog and its relative whiteness just before the color shift, first to a horse the color of rust, for a moment, an animal so distinct from weather phenomena, or is it meant to be a metaphor for the train? And then into the blackening morn and the dark water of the starless heaven of the last line. But beyond poems that literally employ smoke and fog as images, what are some ways that we can pull readers into a feeling of writing from that threshold of consciousness from which we're trying to make out what's there, perhaps even as everything is changing or being reframed? And this is an emotional place that I think Eliot and Plath were both writing from in those poems. I'm thinking of sfumato, a term we usually apply to visual art that was brought to my attention by the poet Jeanette Clough many years ago when she was introducing my first book at a reading. Because it was personal, it really got my attention and I kept thinking about it. Sfumato is most famously applied probably to the work of Leonardo da Vinci, in particular the Mona Lisa. This is the way poet Jeanette Clough applies it to writing. An aura, a luminescence around something, in this case around the words. One may know what each word means separately, but the poem as a whole is more than an exact overlay of the words in it. It's a fuzzy match. You could call the poems faceted, but facets are solid and edgy. A more appropriate term is sfumato. In painting, sfumato is a technique where gradations of tone and color, not of line, incidentally, are used to blur the contours of a form. A painter does this to make an object look like itself, but not quite. And years later, she's added this. Literary sfumato lies in the use of language. The writing is deliberately vague and encompasses a wide, sideways range, as if spreading the poem into a lake of unknown and unseen depth, liquid or frozen, murky or clear, ancient or recently formed. Text curves around the unidentified crux of the poem, trying to connect with an elusive truth. Often lines use speculative terms, could, should, as if, as though, like, maybe, might, perhaps, or refer to the past and future, followed by possible ways to interpret what has been seen, felt, heard, remembered, or guessed, with what action to take in the present. This extended consideration resides in the conditional tense. In a way, from complete ambiguity, a kind of realism emerges. How often we are drawn by curiosity to probe a puzzle of work, being, loss, or love. Like roughing the edges of a painting, writers rough the edges of their writing. The exact is elusive, perhaps unknown. In music, this reminds me of the effect of the sustain pedal, and I'm thinking of a piano, but any instrument, where when that pedal is on, the old note continues to resonate even as new notes are played. It's always struck me as a really magical effect. There's also a wonderful admonition from Lorca in his lecture, Imagination, Inspiration, Evasion, which seems really related to me to this same point. No one should say, this is clear, because poetry is obscure. And no one should say, this is obscure, because poetry is clear. What we must do is search out poetry energetically and virtuously so that it will surrender to us. But we need to have forgotten poetry completely before it can fall naked into our arms. Keep these notions in mind as we hear the opening poem in Carl Phillips' book, Pale Colors in a Tall Field. The last of fanfare. By fire, then, but within view of a rough sea? Yes, he said, and that's perfect, and don't stop. Clouds moving behind, leaves in front, moving. 3 lines. More space than we might expect between the first and second line, and then much more space before the third line, which gives us a sense of pacing. What is happening here? As Helen Vendler might have asked, what is the human situation from which these words might be uttered? It is almost haiku-like in its distillation. It doesn't name what's going on, and yet we are asked to be what this author elsewhere calls athletic readers. We are asked to put the puzzle pieces together as best we can, even in the midst of this moment of change. And if we thought for a second that perhaps a beach bonfire moment was in the offing, the dialogue snatched in that second line is immediately clarifying. In what situation are these short bits of speech uttered? In moments of physical intimacy. And then, after the delay of extended space on the page, that mysterious third line, clouds moving behind, leaves in front, moving, without even a period at the end. The image is clear enough, but from what perspective is this being seen? Is this a glimpse of the surroundings seen during an act of sex or later? At a minimum, we know that these speakers are at least still outside. If clouds and leaves are moving, there is wind, or at least a breeze. Or does the last moving refer to something beyond that, or in addition to? Certainly by the end of the line, there's a lack of closure. We are left in a state of suspension. Yet each line, too, for me anyway, has that feeling we get when a chord is made from 3 suspended notes, even when they don't occur simultaneously. Each line colors and informs our reading of the next and realigns it. And then if we circle back to that title, here's where we get a strong clue that perhaps this is a last hurrah, a last moment in something in the process of ending. I always imagine that the poem coming immediately after this one in the collection may have been written as a result of a request, say from a lover or an editor. Because of this order, this orchestration, this poem, on being asked to be more specific when it comes to longing, is second. My reading of it ties into the scenario we've just moved through, as though the first poem is a sketch for a later drawing that adds detail. Though perhaps we are also moving in time. Perhaps it is just after, or another occasion of shared time outside, walking, and not just walking. When the forest ended, so did the star flowers and wild ginger that had for so long kept us company. The clearing opened before us, a vast meadow of silver rod, each stem briefly an angled argument against despair, then only weeds by a better name again, as incidental as the backdrop the ocean made just beyond the meadow. Like taking a horsewhip to a swarm of bees, that they might more easily disperse, we'd at least reach the point in twilight where twilight seems most a bowl designed to turn routinely, but as if by accident, half roughly over. Bells somewhere, the kind of bells that, before being housed finally in their towers, used to have to be baptized. Each was given to swing by or be hushed inside of, accordingly, its own name. Bells, and then from the smudged edge of all that seemed to be left of what we'd called belief once, bodies, not of hunting birds, what we'd thought at first, but human bodies in flight and lit from within, as if by ruin, or triumph maybe, at having made out of ruin a light, something useful by which, having skimmed the water, to search the meadow now, for ourselves inside it where, yes, though we shook in our nakedness, we lay naked as we'd been taught to do when afraid. What is faith but to make a gift of yourself? Give and you shall receive. Wow. And my impulse here is just to be silent, to pause and let this resonate like a series of sustained chords. The meadow, the ocean, that outdoor physical intimacy, we're somewhat prepared for by the territory of the first poem, but what metaphoric and literal flights, the horsewhip and the bees, so charged as an image in service of simile, that literal shifting of the twilight from that sense of endlessness to the recognition of finiteness. Twilight itself, an embodiment of liminality, a threshold between day and night, and then this feeling of the twilight within the twilight. Those bells, and the way interwoven into the complexity of near persona, they repeat and repeat, much like bells, like an enactment of bells, and then in an almost literalizing of sfumato, that smudged edge, as it's applied to this moment of shifting territory in a relationship, and feels with that near rhyme or back-to-back soft sonic similarity before we move into the strange birds and the return, even if only in memory, to those moments of physical contact between the lovers, as if they are the bodies they can now see, lit by their own ruin, perhaps still hopeful, even in the penumbra of belief. There's such a curious interweaving here of clarity and obscurity, the clear images of the concrete words with the abstract words like faith and belief, and then with the metaphor that seems to underscore the strangeness of how this moment must feel, how strange and yet how beautiful. I find myself returning and returning to these lines, even to try to understand cinematically what is unfolding here on the physical, literal level, as well as imagining what's unfolding in the well of emotion as everything changes underneath. And it's again as if each line both illuminates and makes strange each succeeding line, like a series of footsteps into terra incognita, increasingly incognita. Now I'll skip ahead a few more poems into the collection to read a poem called Instructions Prior, which operates much like the ones we've heard, with an additional twist that it's also in the mode of list poem. And I want to add to this, to your hearing of it, one more idea, which comes from David St. John, and that is the idea that we can imagine a poem as a mobile. If you were to see a poem lying on a table like a mobile. It might just look like a bunch of pieces of metal and tied together by string. But if you were to lift it, and then especially if a breeze were to blow through, you'd understand how each piece of it contributed to the whole experience. And it's so interesting in this poem to see how the instructions are not issued as commands or imperatives, but almost as a list of fragments of what is being noticed. Instructions prior. The tick seed, thriving in banks like clouds beneath us. The idea of a wind. The clean commitment every instinct comes down to in the hawk descending. Actual wind, waves as waves. The idea of a body. Waves as merely interruptions for once across the lake's flattened surface. Only what you yourself mean to it, yes. Your idea of the world. The body as a shield, keeping slightly at bay what it also reflects. Everything you've lived for. Its raised wings macheteing the space between want and having. For hours, I lay beside him in the pear tree's shadow, watching him sleep.